Okay, welcome, sir. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. This is our inaugural session of Nidhi Bodh, an enlightening chat series. As the name suggests, this series is aimed at learning from the experts of the respective fields. Any opinions shared by the speakers will be their own and not a representative of the Public Policy Club or IIM Lucknow. We are thrilled to have Mr. J. Sai Deepak as our first guest today. Mr. J. Sai Deepak is an engineer turned litigator with bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from Anna University, Chennai, and in law from IIT Kharagpur. He practices as an arguing counsel primarily before the Supreme Court of India and the Delhi High Court. He has been practicing for almost a decade now, and he has carved a niche for himself in civil commercial litigation, intellectual property, constitutional law, and competition law. He has made several landmark cases in these fields, such as Tata Sons versus Greenpeace, wherein the law relating to the interplay between constitutional freedoms and IP rights was laid down. He's also argued before a constitution bench of the Supreme Court in the Sabrimala temple entry case and the Padmanabha Swami temple case on the 26th Amendment to the Constitution. He's frequently invited to speak on and teach the subjects by premier law schools of the country. He has been engaged by the Department of Industrial Policy and Promotion, Ministry of Commerce at the Government of India, and is an honorary advisor on the implementation of the IPR policy. So, thank you for gracing us with your presence here today. We would like to hand over the forum to you now and learn about your first-hand experience and some intricacies from the landmark cases that you have had over the years.
So are there any specific questions?
So maybe we could start with a brief introduction, and maybe you could touch upon a few of these cases, and then we'll take up certain.
Okay, done. So contrary to popular perception, I'm not someone who takes up only those matters which are related to temples or whatnot, but seems to be the prevalent opinion, perhaps because some of these matters get the coverage that they get in mainstream media. But I'm fundamentally a commercial litigator, with civil commercial litigation, intellectual property litigation, and antitrust litigation being my areas of specialty. Constitutional law is, of course, something that I'm very, let's say, passionate about. And therefore, I strike, let's say, a balance between commercial litigation and constitutional litigation. The bulk of the commercial litigation is handled before the Delhi High Court, whereas the better part of the constitutional litigation is handled before the Supreme Court. For the first 7 years of my practice, I worked as part of a law firm. In 2015, I was made an associate partner of this firm, which is among the top firms in this country for intellectual property litigation. I quit in June 2016 to set up practice independently as an arguing counsel, which effectively means that I practice only in the arguing mode. I don't draft, I don't file. I'm giving this background for those people who don't understand how let's say, the legal profession or at least the litigation profession works. So therefore, my primary interface is with solicitors and individual lawyers and law firms who engage me on behalf of their clients to argue for them before various tribunals, primarily before the Delhi High Court and the Supreme Court. I completed 12 years of practice on the 14th of July, 2021, this year. And over the last 4.5 to 5 years, I've had, let's say, a fair degree of exposure to constitutional matters of various hues and shades, especially those which are of civilizational importance. And since some of these matters have received the coverage that they have, I think they speak for themselves. In terms of my interests outside of the law, I try and contribute to those causes which I am serious about, of course, in pro bono capacity as part of my pro bono commitments. And some of those causes are, of course, indic in nature. In addition to that, I also participate in matters of national importance wherever I can, which is, let's say, petitions relating to Article 370 or the CA or whatnot. So that's the, let's say, my career, so to speak, in a nutshell. So you're welcome to ask your questions.
So one of the questions that a lot of students had is that they have recently joined us, and a lot of them would be deciding on their career paths and as to which stream to choose or which organization to decide upon. And you were someone who has taken this transition pretty early in your life. So what did you think of, or what were your decisions based on, and what would you want to suggest to these incoming batch of students?
I'm not sure I made the transition pretty early in my life because I made the transition after finishing my undergraduate in engineering. So if I had to rechart the course of my career, I would have perhaps started with a hardcore degree either in political science or in economics, and then coupled it with a 3-year law program. Or perhaps I'd have gone for an integrated law program. The only reason I wouldn't have gone for a 5-year law program is because it lacks the diversity that a 3-year program typically has, because the 3-year program, because of its postgraduate nature, has the tendency to attract a diverse set of people, and therefore you get to meet people coming with a different set of skills. And that makes for a fantastic, let's say, classroom experience in a law program. And that's typically why a JD program in the US is still continued, despite India following a 5-year integrated structure, so to speak. So I finished my engineering at the age of 20. I completed law at the age of 23. And since typically I had at least a year's advantage over the rest of my peers in my engineering days, that helped me to complete my law program at the age of 23. And by the age of 35, I've completed 12 years in the profession. My reasons for making the switch to law has got nothing to do, or they've got nothing to do with any disaffection towards engineering. I certainly took up engineering with a lot of interest. Nobody pushed me into it. And I was extremely serious and keen about pursuing a master's in aerospace engineering post my undergraduation. In fact, like most engineering students of my generation, I was preparing for a GRE. I sat in some of those time classes, so I mean for preparation for GRE and whatnot. And I was very clear about the universities in which I wanted to pursue the aerospace program as well. But somewhere in the 5th or 6th semester after my placements, I started having a brainwave of sorts, primarily because maybe I'm a bit more sensitive to political developments and socio-cultural developments. So it is a function of how much importance one gives to socio-cultural developments in one's own career's path. I took it fairly seriously. And therefore, I wanted to make the transition from engineering to humanities in one way or the other. Law, for all practical purposes, certainly falls within the broader basket of humanities, although it is typically associated with the social sciences. Law cannot be understood independent of social sciences, and therefore I would certainly consider it as a subject that falls within the broader umbrella or penumbras of social sciences. So I wanted to make the transition, and it just so happens that the stars aligned. And in 2006, IIT Kharagpur was starting a program which was effectively the standard LLB with a specialization in intellectual property rights. And since most engineers in this country, in my generation, and I think even in subsequent generations, have been suckers for the IIT brand, I decided to make the switch. And that's one of the triggers, of course. And one of the things I was very, very particular about is that I will not speak on a subject without training or experience in it. Because it's easy to shoot with opinions from the hip, but it's important to put in the grunt work, to put in the effort, gain some qualification. Even if you disagree with the system as it exists and the qualification that is dispensed as such as in date, you must at least know what it stands for before you can hold forth on what it should be. There's no point in speaking about the ought proposition without knowing the is proposition. So these were the reasons for making the transition. Let me be also clear that I have no interest in being a public interest litigator. Not that I disagree with anybody who makes that choice, but that's not something that I'm cut out for, nor am I remotely interested in. I'm fundamentally a commercial litigator who brings those very, let's say, commercial skills and the very same forensic skills to bear on the civilizational causes and the pro bono causes that he chooses. So public policy is something that I'm certainly interested in, but I combine it as much as possible with financial feasibility, because there are realities of life that need to be met. And most importantly, unless and until you're known for your proficiency in subjects which the court takes seriously, you shouldn't be bracketed as someone who's just a pro bono litigator or public interest litigator. That, I think, is something India is still not yet ready for. In certain jurisdictions like America, let's say pro bono litigation is something that has its own following, that has its own sense of respect and pedigree and whatnot. There are people who actually aspired for it right from the beginning. India, I don't think, is ready for it. And even if India were ready for it, I am certainly not cut out for that kind of an activity full time. Therefore, I try to strike a balance as much as possible between my commercial matters and my constitutional matters or my pro bono matters. So that choice was, of course, triggered by a lot of things, but most importantly, the need to present a certain point of view with as much clarity as possible, because I felt that the position that I stand by and a position that I strongly believe in, a worldview that I strongly believe in, was not perhaps getting the best of representation possible in terms of articulation, because of which the young generation was moving in a very different direction altogether. And the possibility of diversity of opinions on campuses was being completely eroded. And I wanted to contribute to the change in my own little way as much as possible. So as opposed to waiting for someone to take the lead, I thought, why don't I make the switch myself? And since I believe that I'm cut out for it, let me see if I'm really good at what I believe I'm good at. So I decided to back myself up. And those transitions were therefore a combination of personal triggers as well as societal triggers. So that's the long and short of it.
It's so nice to hear it from you, because as the future generation, we talk about a lot of issues and we talk about a lot of things that come in the newspapers and the news articles, and we talk about it. But very few of us have that courage to go ahead and do something or make a change about it. So my question is on the same line, sir. Earlier this year,
let's make one request, just one request. It would help if I could see your face as well. Otherwise, it seems like I'm talking to myself, and I'm not very comfortable with that. It seems as if I'm talking to a mirror. So perhaps you could change the video setting. Yes, that's better, much better. Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay, sir.
Because as someone who's a live audience artist, I prefer seeing the face of the people.
I am. Sure, sir. So my question was on the same line, sir. So earlier this year, I remember reading this, the 5th annual democracy report by Sweden's VDEM Institute downgraded India from world's largest democracy to an electoral autocracy. It stated that much of the decline occurred post the 2014 general election. So I wanted to know your opinion, and do you think that this is one of the driving forces for India to be labeled as an autocratic democracy?
So I don't care too much for international labels and what they say about India, because any student of international law will tell you that it's a club. Okay, it's like a gymkhana of sorts. So certain countries sit together and they pass judgments on others. And this is not a political rhetoric for all practical purposes. Any person who understands anything about international relations, power balance, and international law will tell you that the origins are extremely colonial in nature. So let me split the answer to this question in two different baskets. The specific basket is, I've already spoken on this particular report and its utter uselessness on a panel discussion that was put together by King's College London a couple of months ago. And even if I say so myself, I had literally shredded to pieces because it's a report not worth reading, because it almost speaks of the history of, let's say, Indian democracy only from May 2014. So the political motivations behind the particular report are something that cannot be lost sight of. And it so happens that one of the authors is an Indian of that particular report. And therefore, I would want to understand which side of the ideological divide that particular person comes from before passing any comments on the merits of the particular report. And the impression that the report specifically gives is that restrictions on free speech were completely unknown to the history of independent India prior to May 2014, is the broad statement that the particular report makes. And there cannot be a more ahistoric, inaccurate, and let's say, baseless position as far as I'm concerned, because it misses out on the history of repression of free speech under the previous dispensation starting from 1951 itself. Because I'm surprised that the report did not even mention that the very first amendment to the Constitution that was undertaken in 1951 translated to restrictions on free speech, much more than the actual Constitution came out with in 1950. And this was done under Nehru, along with the then Law Minister, the father of the Constitution, Dr. Ambedkar. So there are aspects of the report, frankly speaking, which reek and smack of political bias and ideological bias. So I will not take any of those reports seriously. Point number two, at the general level, international opinion is never innocent, is never not motivated. It certainly has its own bias. And therefore, when a country tries to assert itself and tries to challenge the established global order, you will always find a lot of labels coming your way, simply because they would certainly want to impute autocracy to the positions that you take. I honestly don't put stock in this kind of nonsense. That report is not worth the paper it is actually written on. Frankly speaking, that organization is not even a decade old. So I don't see what kind of credentials and credibility it commands. Okay, so it's not a report that a country like India, with its vast diversity and its institutions, should actually speak of. Let's be very, very clear, and I think it's important to understand the context here. In a neighborhood where diversity is dying, in a neighborhood where you happen to be perhaps the most diverse nation with the largest democracy and with not a single, let's say, history of coup, although an emergency, but never a coup, so to speak. I don't see how is it that anybody can simply stand and hold forth on India being an electoral autocracy or an autocratic electoral democracy. I'm sorry to say that's absolute nonsense. I have no reasons to put stock in that report, and I don't think anybody should be taking it seriously.
Thank you, sir. So we have another question, which is very interesting. It is from Argay Singh. So his question is, India has a rich cultural and spiritual history, but meditation and yoga and all things which are deemed good about our country by Westerners are being increasingly secularized. So can you suggest some good source to learn about our history and spirituality? I would like to tell you guys, sir has written a book. So we will be talking about it. And I think it's a very good source to read about India's history. Over to you, sir.
So I am not someone who's spiritual. Like most people who actually, I mean, it's become fashionable to say that people are spiritual but not religious. I'm certainly not spiritual. Religious, perhaps, yes. Okay, because I don't think I have the maturity for it yet, or I have the patience for it yet. This much I know for a fact, that I'm extremely proud of the civilizational heritage that I think we as a people have inherited. I'm very clear about its source, its origins, and its identity, religious, civilizational, as well as cultural. And my own journey has been that of, let's say, peeling away the layers of ignorance that I'm covered under as a consequence of the education system that we follow in this country. Therefore, whatever I know is not because of the education system, but despite and in spite of the education system. Therefore, I think it's important for people to read outside of what is being prescribed in schools. And fortunately, we live in a generation where the internet has made it possible for dissemination of knowledge as well as democratization of opinion. So therefore, if you're really interested in understanding the history of this country, I would give you a couple of authors that I think you should start reading with. Read all the authors from the fag end of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century who wrote in the context of the Indian national movement, starting from Radha Kumud Mukherjee, Jadunath Sarkar, Romesh Chandra Mazumdar, then Neelakanta Shastri, Pandurang Vaman Kane. All these people I have specifically cited as part of my book. My book is not exactly a book on Indian spirituality and history, but it specifically speaks of India's tryst with colonialism and the mentality that we have inherited as a consequence of that particular tryst. So it has three aspects to it. It has history, it has political science, and it certainly speaks of the constitution. And it tries to understand the impact of history and political science on the constitution. So I have dealt with a significant portion of European history. I have dealt with a significant portion of Indian history. And then I've dealt with a significant portion of India's constitutional history. And since this happens to be a part of what I call the Bharat trilogy, this is just the beginning. And it covers the period between 1492, when Columbus's expedition began, and it started what we know as the Age of Discovery, and it ends in 1919. The second book will cover the period between 1920 and 1951. The third book will cover the period after 1951. So whoever's interested in understanding why we are where we are and why is it that we think in a certain way, I'm not sure I have all the answers, but I have tried to give tentative answers, and I've tried to initiate a certain round of discussions so that, let's say, filters such as secularism don't come in the way of understanding the truth. So I have tried to be as, let's say, candid as possible, citing first-hand literature. Of course, I'm not trying to sell the book here, but if you're interested, please order. It's on Amazon. The book is scheduled for a release a few days before the Independence Day. And after which, I hope to actually start a book tour, and hopefully you'll have more questions after you've read the book.
Sure, sir. Our next question is from Jayant. Jayant, could you please unmute yourself? Okay, probably he is having some issues at the moment. So we'll take next question in the chat box.
Yeah.
By Ankush Dip. So he asks, what are your views on the declining autonomy of bureaucracy by the government of the day?
Autonomy of the bureaucracy in a democracy, I'm so sorry to say, I should put it bluntly, that while the bureaucracy was conceived of as a steel frame, if you were to look at its origins, uh, it is a colonial establishment significantly, which has continued with the same mindset. And for long, there has been a talk of bureaucratic reforms. Because the fact of the matter is, although it is a necessary establishment, and there are quite a few individuals who do fantastic work, and there's no reason to paint everyone with the same brush, it's time that the stranglehold of the bureaucracy on policy making is loosened a bit, because the significant degree of India's stagnation, economic, administrative, and governance related issues must be attributed to the steel frame, this rigid steel frame that it has inherited from the British man, which is the Indian civil service, the Indian administrative service. Okay. So autonomy of bureaucracy is not being undermined, but democracy, I think, is being empowered by ensuring that the elected members of the parliament and the assembly or the legislature, so to speak, both the state and the central, have the power to implement the vision for which they've been voted. So there's what happens typically is the bureaucracy typically labors under the impression that since it has occupied a certain position for several decades, it knows much more than the politician, which must be the case and which is certainly the case. Policy is certainly in the realm of bureaucracy. However, we don't vote for bureaucrats, we vote for members who are elected to the parliament, either at the state level or at the central level. Therefore, there is a mandate that is given to the politician, which he must have the power and the freedom to implement. And if there's a constitutional problem with his vision or the manner in which he implements it, you can always challenge it in court. But if a bureaucracy starts posing hurdles to the implementation of an electoral mandate, I don't see how is it that we're giving, let's say, effect to the concept of the democracy or to the spirit of democracy. So bureaucracy certainly has an extremely important role to ensure that there is continuity of administration, regardless of the change in government. But the bureaucracy cannot assume that it runs the country or that it has the mandate to run the country. Neither is there a social contract between the people and the bureaucracy, nor is there a constitutional position that the bureaucracy occupies. Our contract is with our electoral members. The power is being given to the electoral members, not to bureaucrats. Bureaucrats are primarily downstream implementers of an executive vision. So I don't wish to operate, or let's say, I don't wish to certainly live in a country where the bureaucrat ultimately has all say completely with respect to everything, because that man is an appointee, he is not an elected representative. If you truly wish to call India a democracy and you wish to give effect to that particular concept, I don't see how it makes sense to now create an independent autonomous bureaucracy, because we're already seeing the deleterious effects of an independent autonomous judiciary. I don't want another independent judicial, let's say, autonomous bureaucracy, because then effectively every 5 years that you vote is simply a mockery in the name of democracy. You have really no say in the policy or the manner in which it's implemented. Bureaucracy must effectively see itself as an efficient administrative machinery and of creating policies for the purposes of, let's say, consideration by the politician. But ultimately, the buck starts and stops with the politician, because people vote the politician and not the bureaucrat.
Thank you, sir. We have Jen.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
So I have a question. I just wanted to clarify, like, if the temples of the country, like Tirupati, are taken up by the government as an endowment, then can the government use the riches of this temple by taking their ownership to help the poor of the country?
Not at all. It cannot, it should not, it dare not. It's unconstitutional. The resources of the temple belong exclusively to the community that the institution belongs to. It is Hindu money, period. And there is nothing communal about this. This is a perfectly valid, factual, legal statement. Just as money that belongs to, or the land that belongs to the Waqf board belongs to that Muslim community, or let's say the properties of the church belong to the Christian community, the property of the temple as well as the resources of the temple belong exclusively to the Hindu community. And any use of that particular money can happen only with the consent of the community. And under no circumstances can it be used for any general administrative purposes or secular purposes, no matter how noble they may be, in the name of, let's say, doing good for the people. You want to do good for the people, do it from the Consolidated Fund of India, do it from the taxes that you collect from the people, don't do it from a community's resource. You don't have any rights at all. You can't say, I will nationalize a particular temple and then use that particular temple's resources for the community's good or for the society's good. You first of all have no business nationalizing temples, because you're a secular state according to what you say. And second, even if you take over a certain temple's administration, Your takeover is only to rectify any mismanagement that happens in the particular temple, but not to use the resources of the temple for secular purposes. It is meant exclusively to be used for the community's good and for nobody else. That is the position of the law. And I don't need to actually pander to any kind of, let's say, politically correct notions here. This is the legal position. Hindu money can be used only for Hindu purposes and for the Hindu community, just as Muslim money can be used only for Muslim purposes and for Muslim community. That's exactly how it's worked, and that's how it should work. That is what the Constitution says. So there can't be any deviation from the particular position.
Sure, sir. Thank you very much.
We have another question from Kanu Priya. If Kanu, you could go ahead maybe.
Hello, sir. I'm really fortunate to be part of this. Actually, I followed almost every session of you on Rajya Sabha with Rosen Pereira, and I closely followed your opinion on Sabarimala Temple, and I really liked one of your statements when you said the distinction is not discrimination. And that is something I feel that in India, the entire debate of gender equality has actually got the wrong side. As per me, I mean, it's just my opinion. And I've personally seen people suffering from very blatant misuse of Section 498A. So this is a very specific question that I want to ask you, and I know it's not your field particularly, but as such a luminary of a legal fraternity, what do you think a lawyer should do for the men of India? Because I see a lot of bad things happening because of some of the gender biased media as well as laws. Thank you.
So, Kanupriya, let me thank you for this question, because if a man had asked this question, I'm sure he would have had consequences. And since a lady is asking me this question, I'm so grateful that there are thinking people out there who understand how this provision, which is meant to protect someone, has now become a sword in people's hands. And let me also clarify this with a couple of caveats so that I am not reaching beyond the scope of my expertise. I don't practice criminal law as a trial lawyer, okay? Therefore, my opinions are only as a practitioner of the law, not as a specialist. That's point number one. Point number two, just as in medicine, there are different specialties, in law too, there are different specialties, right? Therefore, a cardiologist should be very, very careful when he speaks of gynecology. Therefore, I'll be extremely careful about, let's say, what I say when it comes to criminal law. Let me just say this at a very limited level. Point number one, what has happened is we have imported even cultural notions and cultural movements from other parts of the world. Okay, so every notion which relates to gender has now been replaced with, if I may use the word, alien notions. There is nothing Indian about our gender notions anymore. Okay, we either imported from the United States, or we imported from Sweden, or we imported from the rest of Europe, or we imported from United Kingdom. What is the Indian perspective of gender? What is the Indian perspective of gender equality? In a country which has fundamentally had a tradition, and not just a tradition, an established practice of thinking of the sacred feminine as well as the sacred masculine. Apart from that, it has also respected the third gender, where it has called it the Tritiya Prakriti, so to speak, as part of our gender discussions in Indic systems. Why is it that we are so slavish in importing all sorts of notions with respect to patriarchy and misogyny from the rest of the world? I don't understand. According to me, for a country or a generation that prides in independence and, let's say, being having a rebellious streak, it has displayed perhaps the worst forms of mental slavery by importing everything from outside. Okay, from movements to solutions. So the problem is also imported, and the solution to deal with the problem is also imported. Okay, so therefore, that is the first level of the problem. Second, I do believe that provisions which protect women are certainly important. Okay, but when you have specific provisions which specifically cater to enhance protection of a certain gender, and on the other hand, you say everything should be equal between all genders, then why don't you have similar provisions for men as well, right? So it's difficult to actually have a certain discussion where equality is typically projected as the outcome which is expected, but the provisions are skewed in a certain fashion, okay? However, let me clarify so that I'm not misunderstood here. Provisions for protection of women, according to me, are necessary, and they must be there. They are a sign of what the society accords in the form of respect and protection for its women. It's extremely important. Whether people like it or not, every culture in every generation has been typically tested on the anvils of the treatment of women. whether you treat them as property, whether you treat them as chattel, whether you treat them as slaves, or whether you give them autonomy, and whether you treat them as people with their own brains and with their own minds and with their own souls. That is how a culture's sophistication and its advancement is effectively understood. So therefore, I am very clear that provisions must exist. However, in this regard, I would certainly want to draw the audience's attention to the work of Madhu Kishwarji, who's written extensively on how provisions such as 498A have been misused and which have effectively wrecked families, which have effectively wrecked individuals and their careers. So while retaining the solution, which is the provision itself, perhaps we must consider certain safeguards. And if somebody decides to simply invoke this provision without any basis, out of vendetta or for retribution or for vengeance, which results in the destruction of career or mental harassment or whatever they may be, there must be consequences equally for it. Unless and until that is done, I'm so sorry to say we will look at a situation where every relationship will be fraught with a potential 498 situation. Okay, and this would translate to breakdown of the family structure. If somebody doesn't believe in the concept of a family, so be it, that's your personal opinion. But a society's fundamental unit is a family in most cultures. And if you have a problem with it, then you establish a separate society. But in most societies, the family is the central unit, and that's what you're trying to protect. The integrity of the family, because you're looking at what kind of circumstances and what kind of atmosphere do you create for children. Do they come out from healthy families, from strong families with a sense of culture, with a sense of rootedness? That is what the entire thing is actually geared at. Therefore, the impact of abuse of these provisions on the family structure and on the mindset of the next generation certainly warrants a review of the existing position. This much I'm very clear about. What should that translate in the form of an exact solution? A specialist should comment. Since I'm not a subject matter specialist, I will keep my mouth shut on that particular issue, but I completely endorse the spirit of your question, and I'm grateful for the question. Next, please.
Thank you, sir. Just like Anupriya, I've been following your work for 2 years, and I was thrilled to have received a reply from you, sir.
Thank
you. We have our next question from Shravan Jain.
Hello, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, please. Yeah, you're audible and visible.
Like Anupriya said, actually fortunate to have a discussion with you. My question actually pertains to something which has been broadly discussed, especially amongst the student community, and it's in regards to the reservations that we have. And I understand that there is a lot of general discussion, but no meat to it when we discuss it. But my question points towards what is your opinion? Because recently, I'm not sure exactly when, but probably in the last 2-3 years, there was some sort of inclusion of economically weaker sections included, wherein at least in institutions like IIMs and all, we have some sort of reservations for them. So what do you think is the future, and where are we currently at if we are thinking of either removing reservations based on caste and creed, because they've been continuing since almost 6 or 7 decades now, and where do you see India headed?
So I've been asked this question before, Shravan, and in 2 or 3 talks, I've already set out my position. To some extent, I am in support of the reservation based on caste, and I gave out a very specific opinion. And I used my own personal experience for this. The experience that I referred to, just allow me to elaborate on this response because I'll give you the context of it. I come from a state board school from undivided Andhra Pradesh. That's where my education was. And in Hyderabad, it so happens that state board students typically believe that students of CBSE are better placed. They know their understanding of English is better, or their grooming is better, or they come from better families. In fact, by and large, based on anecdotal evidence, students from the CBSE board in Hyderabad were typically from the upper middle class families or above compared to state board schools. That's the reality of my generation in Hyderabad. So I can't generalize this. I'm simply basing it on my experience. So if, despite coming from what is known as the general category, if, let's say, I could have certain insecurities or complexes as a consequence of the schooling that I've had, I can only imagine the mindset of those who come from the non-general category. Okay. So obviously then it's difficult to extrapolate that experience to everyone, because there are certainly people who come from well-off families from the reserved category and who are economically better placed than those who come from the general category. So that is a reality. So at the very least, perhaps to strike a balance in the system as it exists, you must certainly have the exclusion of the creamy layer across the board. That must certainly happen. And at some stage, the government must consider putting a generational cutoff. How many generations can someone, let's say, enjoy this for? So while retaining a caste-based reservation policy in principle, it is possible to address certain inequities that exist in the system. Okay. This may perhaps even out the grievances of the general category people with respect to the reservation based on caste. That's point number one. Point number two, I think the introduction of the EWS, the economically weaker section reservation, is a fantastic move in this particular direction because it increases the scope of reservation beyond the metric of caste, where economics becomes the basis for the grant of reservation as opposed to caste. So I think it's a fantastic move. Three is a larger discussion because you see this entire reservation is based on our understanding of caste, right? What is the nature of caste? How do you give a caste identity? What is the caste certificate? And in this particular regard, there is a mountain of scholarship that specifically says that caste as an identity has become rigid only under the colonial establishment because they decided to make it an administrative category. And because they decided to make it an administrative category, your caste as a community is not fluid anymore, but it has become rigid. Okay. So there is a decent chance that you as a certain caste could move between V1 and V4. And when I say V1 and V4, I'm referring to the Chaturvarna system. You could have moved from V1 to V4 at different points of time in history. But assuming that you were at V4 when the British man entered, you shall remain V4 for the rest of your existence because he decided to make it a rigid structure. Okay. Therefore, I believe it is important for at least this generation to have an honest discussion because our discussions around caste start and end with Dr. Ambedkar. Okay. Dr. Ambedkar, with due respect to his erudition and scholarship, was a fantastic scholar of the law and economics, but he was certainly not a trained historian. He certainly had his serious, let's say, drawbacks when it comes to understanding of India's culture, understanding of India's societal structures, and understanding of India's history. I'm not denying the lived experience that he must have gone through or the discrimination that he may have suffered. But let us not forget that throughout his education, Dr. Ambedkar was supported by one person or the other. In fact, Ambedkar is not even his original surname, that happens to be the surname of a teacher. So therefore, here is a situation where this gentleman has been at the receiving end of the, let's say, the blessings and the munificence and the generosity of everyone around him. Okay, so that is his experience also. We must consider that as well. Second, it's important to therefore look beyond Dr. Ambedkar when we look at discussions surrounding caste. There are any number of books that have been written on this particular subject, and I'm grateful for this question, Shravan, because I have addressed some portions of this discussion as part of my book as to what is the impact of the British man's understanding of Varna and Jati and what is it translated in the form of the caste structure. Okay, there is a fantastic book and I would recommend all of you to read it. It's called Castes of the Mind, written by Nicholas B. Dirks. And this book, let me see if I have it here. Just a second. I think it's in my library downstairs. So this book is, I think it was published in 2002. Is a fantastic book that captures the evolution of what we understand as caste today. Caste comes from the Portuguese word casta. Okay, that's where its origins are. And how French missionaries were responsible for creating this particular structure. And the work of the French missionaries was subsequently adopted by the British colonizer when he decided to set up the administrative hierarchy in Bharat. Okay. So the French missionary is, he goes by the name Abbe Dubois, Abbedubois. Okay, I think that's his name. And this gentleman was responsible for creating the first comprehensive records of Bharat society as it existed at that point. And this book was purchased, the copyright to that book was purchased by the then Governor General of Madras Presidency. I think it was either William Bentinck or Warren Hastings. I'm sorry, I don't remember it exactly. It's mentioned in my book. And that becomes the basis for the administrative ossification of caste, where it becomes formally, let's say, a rigid structure. So unless and until we have a discussion on this, we will constantly proceed on the basis that one particular community has been a victim for eternity and shall remain a victim for eternity. And the rest of the communities were always in the general category. Here, general category and this Dalit and SC/ST are words that came into existence after Dr. Ambedkar. They never existed before. Dalit as a word was invented by Dr. Ambedkar. It's not as if it existed before. Okay. So with due respect to Dr. Ambedkar, and without insulting his experience or his erudition when it comes to law and economics, when you read his book Annihilation of Caste, and then you see his discussion with with Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi during the course of the entire book, he ends up admitting that he has never read any of the scriptures firsthand because he doesn't know Sanskrit. He never knew Sanskrit. In fact, that was his biggest regret, that he never learned Sanskrit as a language. On the one hand, if you believe that all scriptures in Sanskrit are necessarily casteist in nature, then how can you comment on it without knowing Sanskrit as a language? You must at least be proficient in the language of the scripture before commenting on the nature of the scripture. I'm so sorry, but Dr. Ambedkar certainly had his pitfalls. See, if we can find faults with, let's say, Sri Ram as a character, I'm certainly sure that we can certainly find fault with Dr. Ambedkar. Nobody is, let's say, exempt from scrutiny, and nobody should become so sacred, at least living personalities and historical personalities who are beyond the scope of scrutiny. Because any comment that translates to an examination of Dr. Ambedkar will now be given a casteist color, will now be given a casteist character, so to speak. Therefore, I think it's important to certainly consider Dr. Ambedkar's opinions and his experience, but this discussion should go much beyond him, because the history of this country and the history of, let's say, Varna and Jati goes much beyond Dr. Ambedkar. Dr. Ambedkar perhaps occupies a certain position in this particular discussion, but to make him the whole and soul of this particular discussion, I'm so sorry, I disagree. That has no basis in Bharat's history, and that would be antithetical to reason and logic. So unless and until you have the discussion, whenever you start the, let's say, the conversation around reservation, if you happen to come from a certain community, you'll be told you have to shut up because you come from the oppressor community. And if you happen to come from another community, his point will always have to be true because he apparently comes from the supposedly oppressed community. This kind of a logic cannot work, because then there is no room for a dialogue. There is always going to be an imbalance in the nature of the discussion. For you to set that imbalance right, I think the first starting point has to be history.
Thank you, sir. So, because as you mentioned that nobody living or the historical character should be beyond the scope of scrutiny, I have one question. So, CGI being the master of roster, how fair is it for a CGI to sit in for a case that is against him? Can this be a threat to judicial moving ahead?
I think I understand the context of the question. So I don't think any person should be the judge of his own cause, especially when they happen to occupy, let's say, a constitutional position, especially in the judiciary. So unfortunately, because I'm trained in India as a lawyer, I have the misfortune of knowing the Latin, let's say, phrase for this, or the Latin usage for this. It's nemo debe esse judex in propria causa, which means no person should be a judge of his own cause. Okay, so when the allegation happens to be of a certain character, and regardless of the allegation, I don't think it's right for a person occupying a certain position, and certainly not the position of the Chief Justice of India, to sit in judgment of his own cause. And that, I think, sets a terrible, terrible precedent. Because I think when you ask for independence and autonomy as an organization or as an institution, the first expectation is transparency, accountability, and humility. Independence without humility will certainly lead to unfettered arrogance. Okay. And when someone asks for independence and says that as a constitutional body, I cannot be open to any kind of scrutiny from the executive and the legislature, then I would certainly expect greater transparency from your end. And I would certainly expect a bit more of humility from your end, so that you understand that people have the equal right to criticize you for your conduct and to question you for your conduct. Because I have the right to vote someone out of power every 5 years or 4 years. But what is the remedy that I have against a person who's occupying an appointed position, and where the, let's say, the top person has the right to appoint his own successor? I don't see in which other jurisdiction, let's say, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of a certain country has the power to occupy, or let's say, appoint his own successor, whether it's in the form of a collegium or whatever it may be. The process is certainly not transparent. So I completely agree with you that the context which you're referring to was inappropriate and was a terrible, terrible precedent.
Thank you, sir. We have our next question from Madhav Agarwal.
Yeah,
Madhav, please go unmute yourself.
I just read an interesting question. Why is legal jargon filled or language filled with jargon? I just read that. Can I respond to that first?
Sure, sir.
Yes, sir, go ahead.
Yes, so I think it's see, it's like this. The understanding is that because law is applicable to everyone, therefore it must be understood by everyone. So let me clarify this. Perhaps constitutional law needs to be understood by everyone, okay? And therefore the language can be simpler, but you can't say that of, let's say, commercial litigation. You can't say that of other forms of law because they are meant to be specialist in nature. Because every form of law or every aspect of law sometimes caters to a very specialist audience. So for instance, patent litigation and patent law have their own unique terms. So you can't say, please, let's make it understandable by everyone. It needs to be understood by the people who belong to the particular fraternity and who apply that on a regular basis. So it's like this. Mobile phones are used by everyone, but does everybody understand the technology inside the mobile phone? Not at all. It's not meant to be that way. So this expectation that law is fundamentally meant to be simple, law is meant to be clear without a doubt, but you cannot avoid specialization, you can't avoid technicality. Now, in terms of jargon, what may seem jargon to you may seem completely normal to the practitioner of the particular subject. So for instance, let's take development as a certain profession. Development professionals have a very specific jargon and a very specific glossary that they subscribe to. What is the meaning of sustainable development is completely understood only by a development professional and not by anybody else. So every profession has a tendency to create its own dictionary, to create its own lexicography, which is best understood by people coming from the particular fraternity. So because law happens to be something that is commonly criticized or critiqued or debated, therefore the expectations that law must be simple. Name one jurisdiction where law is completely simple, or name one era where law is completely simple. Never in the history of let's say human society has law been very, very simple, because then where would be the need for lawyers? Can you name any aspect of history or any period of history when there was never a profession called the lawyer? Not possible. Because that means something is meant for interpretation. That means there is scope for ambiguity, which means it is filled with jargon, which requires interpretation, right? Let's take a very simple concept. Dharma as a word has several commentaries written, multiple commentaries written, several bhashyas written. And fundamentally, when asked to translate, it will translate to what? Justice or righteousness. But is that the only understanding of dharma? No, it has multiple layers. Therefore, this expectation of simplicity is, let's say, is the expectation of someone who's perhaps frustrated with the legal language, but every profession has its own lexicon, and that is the nature of it, and that can't be changed. Because tomorrow when somebody wants to talk about constitutional reforms, I'll be told by one genius, in fact, I've had this conversation with a lot of people who come and tell me, America has such a small constitution, such a short constitution. Why does India need such a big constitution? Are the histories the same? Are the circumstances the same? You had 565 princely states that came together to form this union. All those negotiations for several years must be captured in the form of a document, because ultimately it's a contract between two unions, which is the princely state and the Indian Union, between two sovereign countries. All those aspects will have to be captured. Ultimately, it's a document that reflects the history of the formation of each country. So can you equate the history of the formation of America with the let's say the history of formation of Bharat? No, you can't. So when we draw these simplistic parallels, we completely miss out on the historical context. Let's understand the broader perspective that a legal document is firstly informed by the history that it is the product of. If you don't know the history of the document, you typically don't understand the document. Next question.
Madhav, if you could go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Please.
Good evening, sir. Big fan of yours. I really enjoy your talks on Upward or Sangam Talks or any platform that you take.
Thank you.
Sir, I wanted to ask a question regarding UAPA. So I think you addressed in one of your talks regarding this, that some law should be there to prevent criminal activities. However, recently, what I've seen in the news is that the police or the executive is not able to prove the criminality of a lot of these people. And what happens is that it feels as if this is a gray area where we don't know how to apply a certain law, or whether, because some innocent guy can go, he will be tortured for a certain time and be released and his life is destroyed. So what is your opinion on this?
Okay, let's do a simple sample study. What is the conviction rate of murder charges in this country? How many murder charges are proved in this country? We don't know. How many rape allegations are proved in this country? We don't know. How many sexual harassment complaints are proven right in this country? We don't know. How many dowry allegations are proved right in this country? We don't know. How many cases of, let's say, molestation are proved in this country? We don't know. Compared to that, even when it comes to sedition, it will be the same situation, right? Because the thing is, you're looking at sedition in isolation, but look at the legal system in general. The question is, so I'll give you a different example. In maybe, let's say, 50% of the cases, perhaps the charge of sedition fails. Let's assume that is the case. I would say that is the nature of the system, okay? And merely because the prosecution has failed to establish its case with respect to sedition, it doesn't mean that at the outset they had no reasonable basis to at least use that particular charge, okay? Because it's like this. So what is the process? मैं आपको थोड़ा इसको समझाने की कोशिश करता हूँ. So just pay attention to this. When the police typically decides to level charges, apart from multiple considerations, the first question is, on the face of it, which is prima facie, इस केस के लिए ये चार्ज लागू होता है या अप्लाई होता है या नहीं, एक बेसिक सवाल पूछा जाता है, ओके? ये बाद में प्रूव होगा या नहीं होगा, वो अलग स्टैंडर्ड होता है, ये बाद में एस्टैब्लिश होगा. So it's not as if the policeman collects all the evidence and then says, now I think I will go for this. At the outset, he is basically asking himself, एक basic case established हुआ है कि नहीं? Trial की बात जो है वो बाद में होगी, okay? Because the process of trial comes much later, right? And trial के जो मापदंड होते हैं या जो benchmarks होते हैं वो थोड़ा ज़्यादा होते हैं, because it's the standard of reasonable doubt, beyond reasonable doubt, right? So if that is the standard that is to be applied at the outset, तब तो आधे से ज़्यादा केस दर्ज भी नहीं होंगे, okay? So put yourself in the shoes of, let's say, a student of JNU, and you witness your colleagues from the same institution raising anti-Bharat slogans, okay? And you decide to record a particular video, okay? And you decide to give it to the policeman, okay? वीडियो आपके हाथ में है, जो लड़का इसको देख चुका है वो आपको वीडियो आके दे गया है, तो आपके हाथ में एक वीडियो एविडेंस भी है और एक आई विटनेस भी है, ओके? एट द वेरी लीस्ट आप क्या करेंगे? कुछ तो मटेरियल है जिसके बेसिस पे कार्रवाई शुरू हो सकती है, पीरियड, ठीक है? ये वीडियो फैब्रिकेटेड है, इस लड़के ने बैठ के इसको तैयार किया किसी को यूज करके, ये सब एनालिसिस ये पहले करेगा या बाद में होगा? थिंक अबाउट इट, okay? So every case that fails is not proof of that it is a fundamentally let's say failed case which shouldn't have been started in the first place. Analysis ऐसे नहीं हो सकता है. That's point number one. However, I certainly agree that at least in 30% of the cases, sedition is used in a very politically motivated fashion across the board. There is no running away from this, okay? Now, इसका typically ये जवाब दिया जाता है कि sedition की क्या जरूरत है? Where is the freedom of dissent? Freedom of dissent doesn't mean that you sit and ask for the destruction of this country. Nowhere, impossible. No jurisdiction will tolerate this. China के साथ compare करने की कोई जरूरत नहीं है. United States won't allow this. UK will not allow this. Sweden will not allow this. France will not allow this. Australia will not allow this. Nobody will allow this. Okay. Criticism of the country, let's say of the government, is not sedition. That is the law. Criticism of the state is also okay. But अगर आप ये कहते हैं कि भारत तेरे टुकड़े होंगे और उसके साथ आपने एक रिलीजियस स्लोगन भी जोड़ दिया, तो भैया हम चुप थोड़ी रहेंगे उसके बाद. आफ्टर दैट तो कानून अपना काम तो करेगा, राइट? भारत में तो कानून काम करता है, बाकी देशों में कुछ और काम करता है. The rest of the people will immediately be up in arms. Okay? It's in India that we keep our mouth shut. और अभी बोला जा रहा है that even the government should not be doing its job. So here's two aspects. One is you must find a solution to address aspects of abuse of the seditious provision. Point number one. On that, I agree with you. With the clarification that criticism of the state and the criticism of the government is not asking for destruction of the state. These are two different things altogether. Three, you can always say एक ही चीज को डील करने के लिए आईपीसी में एक प्रोविजन है, यूएपीए में एक प्रोविजन है, कितने प्रोविजंस होने चाहिए? ठीक है, आप उनमें से किसी एक को निकालो, एक को रख लो, नो प्रॉब्लम. बट सेडिशन की जब बात होती है तब कहते हैं कि यूपीए को हटाओ. जब यूएपी की बात होती है तब कहते हैं सेडिशन को हटाओ. इट्स ऑलमोस्ट एज इफ people use one as a pretext for the other. Does it mean that they don't want any fetters on sedition at all? ये तो नहीं हो सकता है, right? You can always say 10 कानून के बजाय आप एक कानून रख लो जो सेडिशन के साथ डील करता है. 100%. But you ask all these people, ठीक है, सेडिशन के लिए कोई प्रोविजन होना चाहिए या नहीं होना चाहिए? उस पर कभी सीधा जवाब नहीं आएगा. तब फ्री स्पीच के लिए ये इमीडिएटली बात करेंगे, लेकिन दे विल नेवर से हाँ सेडिशन के लिए एक प्रोविजन हो सकता है जो स्पेसिफिक होना चाहिए और जो क्लियर होना चाहिए. एंड अगर कोई फॉल्सली अक्यूज किया जाता है तो उसके लिए भी कोई लेट्स से कॉन्सिक्वेंसेस होने चाहिए. तो प्रॉब्लम की इतने सारी सॉल्यूशंस हैं, बट दे वुड वांट यू टू थ्रो द बेबी आउट विद द बाथ वाटर, व्हिच इज टू से सेडिशन एज अ कांसेप्ट को पूरी तरह से हटाओ. When somebody makes that mischievous argument, I'm sorry to say I have to ask this question. भैया आपके इरादे क्या है? What is it that you want to do? किस बात की छूट चाहिए आपको? Do you want to convert even JNU as a Lal Chowk from Srinagar? We won't allow this. Certainly we won't allow this. Why should the government take a position on this? As an Indian, I have the right to take a position on this, and I have a duty to take a position on this regardless of what the government says. We don't want Kashmirization of the rest of the country. We certainly don't want that to happen. The consequences of that particular nonsense we are anyway facing for so many decades, will we allow the rest of the country to follow suit and follow the same pattern? Impossible. What happens to my rights and what happens to my safety then? The country's safety and the existence of the state is the primary, let's say, guarantee of your own safety. अगर देश नहीं रहा या राष्ट्र नहीं रहा, तो आप क्या रहेंगे? You are effectively paving the way for balkanization of Bharat. That is exactly what will happen, right? So sedition के मुद्दे पे जब भी आप प्राइम टाइम टेलीविजन चैनल्स पे डिबेट्स को सुनते हैं, जो कहा जाता है उसके पीछे के सोच को समझने की कोशिश कीजिए, क्योंकि लोग कुछ कहते हैं लेकिन सोचते कुछ और है. Okay, so it's important to decipher what is this intention, what is the ultimate goal, इनका मकसद क्या है. It is important, ये तो जानना बहुत जरूरी है, क्योंकि मकसद के बगैर आजकल कोई कुछ बोलता ही नहीं है. As clear as that. Next.
Next
We
we
take up
have
one question from
Abhijit.
Abhijit next. Abhijit.
I think he's having some internet issue. We'll take next question from
Yeah, hello. Yeah, hi. Good evening, sir.
Good evening. Good evening.
Yeah, it's nice to have you with us today. Sir, since you have mentioned that you have dealt with many of the commercial litigations, there is a prevalent view that the managers at a senior level, they need to have an understanding of law. And if you see in the US, Howard University also offers this course of business and law, this joint degree. But India, we don't see, support for that particular view. What is your opinion on it, especially at the higher level? Should managers have basic knowledge of law, or they should just, in fact, specialization in law, or they should just rely on the legal department in the companies?
So, because I've never occupied an in-house position, and I've never worked in a company and I've only practiced as a litigator, बाहर से जो मुझे समझ में आता है उसके बेसिस में अपना आंसर दे रहा हूँ. Okay. So one, there is a master's degree in business laws which is offered by NLSIU Bangalore. Okay, so that is it can, I'm sure it can be taken up by anyone. I don't think you need to have a law degree for that. In fact, that precisely caters to the kind of requirements that you're looking at. Okay, I think you should seriously consider that if you're interested in that. Now, law se zyada, I think it's important to have an understanding of litigation sense. Okay, or the commercial value of using law as a tool. Okay, because it's not just a question of people having a difference of opinion in contracts, okay, which leads to litigation. Use of law is typically part of competitive business intelligence. Okay, because you're trying to either outrun the other person, and if you can't, you're trying to slow the pace of his ability to walk or run. That's how the world works, at least that's how the competition works today. Okay, so therefore, अगर किसी को sue करते हैं, तो क्या आप उनके innovation को रोकने के लिए sue कर रहे हैं, या फिर अपने innovation के let's say term को expand करने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं by preventing them from launching a product which would compete with yours. Okay, so I would certainly expect managers at a certain level to have an understanding of the strategic use of law as a tool more than the specifics of the law. कोई आपसे ये तो उम्मीद नहीं रखता है कि आपको कानून के provisions पता हो. Okay, अगर पता हो, then that's fantastic. Okay, but beyond that, the question is, what can be done legally to prevent you from implementing the vision that you have is a question that I'm sure everybody should ask. I'll give you a simple example. I've always been a litigator. Okay, but when I started writing the book, I started thinking like a litigant, which is, how is it that people can raise objections with respect to my book? If the book is my product, how can the book become the subject of litigation? What is it that people can ask or object to? ये सवाल मुझे पूछना पड़ता है. Now the thing is, even if I were not a lawyer, as an author, I would have asked this question. Similarly, as a business manager, it is absolutely imperative for you to understand this. And dare I say this, if you happen to be in a space where innovation makes a huge difference, all the more reason that you must absolutely be aware of the use of IP laws and competition law, either to protect your market or to protect yourself from being attacked by others, especially if you happen to be a startup entity, if you happen to be a mid-level entity. Extremely important for people to have their own legal budgets. I am not saying this as a self-serving exercise so that my fraternity benefits from this. All I'm saying is, startups typically have the best of innovative ideas when it comes to technology. There is a reason why startups are so heavily sought after in Israel or in Europe, in Germany or in America, because actual innovation comes from the startups and then they're acquired by others, usually at least in 6 to 7 out of 10 cases. And startups typically don't have the heft in terms of money or in litigation resources, which is why they're started with litigation before they can launch a product. Okay. Therefore, if you happen to be in a space which is full of innovation, or if you happen to be in the startup space, extremely important for business managers to be aware of the strategic use of law. 100%. There's no avoiding it at all. I hope I've answered your question. Okay, next.
Thank you, sir. Next, we have Ankur. Ankur, please go ahead, unmute yourself and ask your question.
Good evening, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, please go on.
Sir, it has been really great listening to you. This is my first time I'm hearing a litigator speak. So I had just this question on the previous question that you answered. It would borderline on that. So technology in its own history has a tendency to make things accessible for common people. So what is your view on the legal startups that have been originating in this country that are trying to mainstream the legal knowledge for the common people? Do you think they will ever have a far-reaching impact as to where they will make the, say, legal system faster for the common people or the weaker sections of the society? And if not, what should be done in that regard? Thank you.
So I don't think startups can facilitate speeding up the process of justice. Okay, वो तो नहीं हो सकता है, simply because that is dependent on the judiciary as a machinery. Okay, and unless and until both the society as well as the state invest significantly in that particular direction, I don't see the situation improving. Legal knowledge अगर ज़्यादा होता है, तो इसका मतलब ये होगा that more cases will be filed, but the pace of the cases will not change. Okay. Previously, if people did not know, अच्छा इस केस में मुझे केस फाइल करने का opportunity था, they will perhaps understand it better now. Okay. But that only means, as opposed to 6 people previously being aware of this, now 10 people will be aware, but the system remains the same. Okay. So I don't see this as having a very positive impact in terms of movement towards a faster justice dispensation system. However, the more litigation savvy people become and the more legal savvy people become, they will automatically start expressing the desire to the state that hum itna paisa laga ke yahan pe lad rahe hain, why can't you improve the process? Why can't you improve the quality of the process? Why can't you improve the quality of the people who are actually presiding over the process? So it could perhaps translate to more pressure on the state to improve the system and to, let's say, get its act together. Okay. Now, the primary positive benefit would be quite a few things which perhaps were much more expensive because there were a limited number of people in the market. Obviously, because of the expansion of more stakeholders and players in the market, it makes certain options much more financially feasible. Okay. And especially if you happen to be a legal process outsourcing entity, then there's a decent chance that issues relating to transactions could be made easier. Transactional queries and contractual queries could be made easier. Drafting can become more or less a template-based exercise. But even then, I'm not a huge fan of a template-based exercise because it ultimately, every consideration and every negotiation will have to be factored when you draft the contract. But a basic ढांचा होगा जिसके ऊपर आप उसको और build कर सकते हैं. So there can be a basic mold which can then be worked and used for, let's say, to refine it to suit a certain situation. So this is the limited change. Remember one thing for a fact. Most jurisdictions which have a tendency to invest better in technology are not particularly litigation friendly because they try and limit the supply of lawyers in that particular society and they improve the supply of the technological pool in that country. Okay. I would always be wary of a situation where the supply of lawyers is more than the supply of innovators and entrepreneurs and people who are interested in creating jobs on the technology side. Okay. So by default and by design, some professions are meant to be limited in their outcome. So for instance, you can't have too many chartered accountants, which is precisely why every year the number of vacancies are decided by the ICAI or whatever it may be, or even for that matter, even company secretaries. Okay. Similarly, for lawyers also, I think there must be a certain limit that must be applied. Otherwise, across the country, you have what, 18,000 colleges, 19,000 colleges. Really, where is the opportunity? Okay, where will all these people ultimately be housed? So therefore, you can have perhaps greater business models that try and innovate in the field of law. That will not translate to better justice dispensation system. That's the first response. Second is the cautionary response that in any society, supply of lawyers should be limited and should be controlled. Next.
Thank you, sir. We'll be taking last question from Krishna Kumar now.
Yes.
Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So first of all, I would like to thank PPC to organize this session. This is the best thing which has happened after coming to IIM Lucknow. Yes. Sir, and I would also like to tell that for shortly before coming to IIM Lucknow, I studied for civil services. And I used to follow Sir ardently, and still now I retweet his every tweet on Twitter. So sir, go and check. So my first question is, sir, we see that China is bullying everyone. He's bullying us near Ladakh. He's occupying places in Arunachal Pradesh, and it itself doing so much of atrocities in the Xinjiang province on the Uyghur Muslims. And we see Indian government not taking any stand. They're not even recognizing Taiwan. They're not even engaging freely with the Dalai Lama. So the attitude in which India operates and the attitude in which Israel operates are two completely different poles apart. So why Indian government has always taking a defensive stance and not being aggressive? That's my question.
So I understand कि इजराइल से कंपेयर करने की नेसेसिटी क्यों पड़ रही है, मुझे समझ में आ रहा है. बिकॉज इजराइल उतना छोटा देश होते हुए भी एक क्लियर पोजीशन ले पाता है when it is surrounded by, or let's say it lives in a hostile environment. Okay, because it's impossible to take a direct flight from Bharat to Israel. आपको तुर्की से जाना पड़ता है, इस्तांबुल से जाना पड़ता है, because the airspace in between is not recognized. Okay, so that is the circumstance of the situation in which Israel actually lives. I get all of that, but एक तरफ पाकिस्तान है जो एक न्यूक्लियर आर्म्ड नेबर है, और दूसरा तरफ चाइना है who is equally nuclear armed and which is the largest army in the world today. इसको हम इजराइल के सिचुएशन के साथ नहीं कंपेयर कर सकते हैं. Point number one. Point number two, Israel has always had a huge lobby in America's Congress. Okay, Therefore, उनको हर साल जो है billions of dollars का aid आता है. Weapons का development जो है, Israel and United States, they take it up together, right? Israel's presence is strategically important for the West, and by the West I mean both Europe as well as the United States. Okay, because Israel happens to represent an outpost of the West in the Middle East, and Middle East is important for oil. Okay, so its geostrategic positioning effectively translates to its better negotiating power with respect to United States. वरना इजराइल जैसे देश को United States क्यों इतना भाव देता? It's such a small country. What is the difference? I mean, the length of Israel and the breadth of Israel, I'm sorry to say, is not more than the greater Mumbai area or the greater Bangalore area. ऊपर से नीचे अब 3 घंटे, left से right तक अब 3 घंटे, बात खत्म. That's it. Okay. It's perhaps 1/50th the size of India and smaller than the state of New Jersey. Okay. So why is Israel so important for United States? Because of its location. Okay, it's very, very important. So that unfortunately, Pakistan occupies a better geostrategic positioning because of its location, and that is why it's able to negotiate better with the West. एक तरफ वो यहाँ वेस्ट के साथ negotiate करता है कि भारत के नाक में हमेशा दम करता रहेगा. Okay, so therefore they're in a much better position to bargain there. Plus, since it has decided to collaborate with China, which is equally interested in preventing India's rise, obviously it is well positioned, because अगर आपने अपने पूरे फ्यूचर को सिर्फ इस एक बात पे आपने उसको बेस किया है that मुझे किसी भी हालत में दूसरे का जीना हराम करना है in every way possible, then multiple options open up, and that's exactly how that state operates. Now, as far as China is concerned, I completely agree with you that all these years India's policy towards China has been extremely accommodating and embarrassingly accommodating. Okay, you should have never recognized the one China position at all, क्योंकि आपका immediate neighbor तिब्बत होना चाहिए था, चाइना नहीं होना चाहिए था. Okay, Tibet was your neighbor until the invasion of Tibet by China in 1955. Okay, आप उस समय चुप रहे, जिसके वजह से आपको भुगतना पड़ा. Apart from moral reasons, Tibet represents an extremely strategic place because all your primary rivers come from Tibet. ब्रह्मपुत्र सब कुछ वहीं से आता है, और आज के डेट में ये सारा जो रिसोर्स जो है उसका स्रोत जो है चाइना के हाथ में है. ओके, अपार्ट फ्रॉम दैट आपका जो इलेक्ट्रॉनिक इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर है, स्पेसिफिकली टेलीकॉम इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर जो है, आज भी चाइना से इंपोर्ट हुआ जा रहा है. सो गवर्नमेंट बदला है लेकिन नीति इस विषय में बदली नहीं है, विच इज द प्रॉब्लम. ओके, अगर हुआवे के बारे में इतने सारे कंट्रीज इंक्लूडिंग यूरोपियन कंट्रीज एंड ऑस्ट्रेलिया ने डिसाइड कर लिया है कि हम इनसे कुछ इंपोर्ट नहीं करेंगे, ये सिर्फ हुआवे पे रुकना नहीं चाहिए. यू हैव टू इफेक्टिवली लुक एट एवरीबॉडी एल्स, बिकॉज एवरी प्राइवेट एंटिटी इन चाइना इज नॉट स्ट्रिक्टली अ प्राइवेट एंटिटी. उसका गवर्नमेंट का हाथ कहीं ना कहीं पे है, either by the CPC, which is the Chinese Communist Party, or the PLA controls some of these entities. So you have to be extremely careful in terms of allowing them to. भारत के अंदर ही इतने सारे collaborators बैठे हैं जो चाइना के साथ हाथ मिलाते हैं, either for political reasons or ideological reasons, या कुछ parties के तो stated goals होते हैं जो माओ को पूरा एक let's say they give him an exalted status, they put him on a pedestal. So when you have such political operators sitting inside your country, you first of all have to deal with the collaborators inside this country. Unfortunately, Bharat इस विषय में strong position नहीं ले रहा है. I would strictly ban any party that has any ideological affiliation with Maoism under any circumstances. Mao के होते अगर भारत का आक्रमण हुआ था 1962 में, how can you have a party that believes in Maoism in this country? You can't, you shouldn't, under no circumstances. Or for that matter, any organization that has any kind of remote ideological affiliation with anything the Chinese Communist Party believes in should be banned in this country. It's not a question of free speech, it's a question of survival. Free speech तभी होगा जब भारत होगा. 2, हम लद्दाख की बात किए जाते हैं, but you have rightly raised the question of Arunachal. There have been at least 15 to 16 incursions in Arunachal that have been reported several times. Okay, so China is effectively trying to create a greater China. So first of all, China was limited until the invasion of Tibet. उसके बाद तिब्बत को उसने खा लिया. Then it has taken over certain portions. Now Nepal is also under the heavy influence of China. Some villages have gone, which have completely been dominated by China now. Pakistan has become the all-weather concubine of China for all practical purposes. फिर लद्दाख में वो ये सलामी स्लाइसिंग कर करके लैंड को खाए जा रहा है, एंड वहां पे इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर बिल्ड किए जा रहा है. Uttarakhand is the next target because it is strategically positioned. Then they will slowly move in this particular direction. And previously, what was known as Nefa, Arunachal Pradesh ke baad Assam will be the next area. Chicken snake, what is known as the chicken snake, which connects Bharat with Northeast, usko target karenge. The only way to actually counter China, and this is something that several people have said, I'm not an expert on this, but from whatever they have said, it understands only the language of force and it understands the language of economics. You can't keep benefiting China economically by opening your markets to them and then hope that in the interest of economy, he will stop attacking you militarily. That is not the Chinese position. वो economy से भी benefit करेगा and he will continue to use it to beef up his infrastructure on the border. Okay? इतने साल आपने चाइनीज को यहाँ पे मार्केट का एक्सेस दिया, उसके बाद भी गलवान हुआ, उसके बाद भी लद्दाख हुआ. So what is this logic that अगर आप इकोनॉमिक्स इनके साथ करेंगे then चाइना हमें अटैक नहीं करेगा? China is fundamentally an expansionist mindset. वो किसी भी हालत में अपने आप को एक्सपैंड करके रहेगा because he wants to establish himself as not just the regional superpower, he wants to establish himself as the sole superpower. When he is willing to do this to the United States of America, he effectively wants all other countries around him to be his satellite states. That we have to dance to his tunes. And they have a very clear vision because the Chinese Communist Party has a vision at least for the next 50, 60 years. They know exactly what they want and how they want to achieve it. Now, unfortunately, Bharat has a lack of clarity in terms of its civilizational vision. And second, because you're a democracy, आपके पॉलिसीज में वही कंटिन्यूटी नहीं हो सकता है जो चाइना में होता है. ओके, अगर उन्होंने डिसाइड किया कि ऊपर से नीचे हमें एक स्ट्रेट लाइन ड्रॉ करना है और इस रोड को बनाना है, तो यूज थरूर्स एग्जांपल, वो जरूर कर सकते हैं. भारत में ऐसे नहीं हो सकता. सो आई एम नॉट सेइंग वी शुड आल्सो अडॉप्ट अ चाइनीज मॉडल, बट वी कैन रिटेन आवर डेमोक्रेटिक स्पिरिट एंड स्टिल स्ट्रेंथन द, लेट्स से, आवर फंडामेंटल इंस्टीट्यूशंस दैट प्रोटेक्ट अस. And हमारे securities agencies को भी आप politicize नहीं करना चाहिए because that is what exactly happened from 2004 to 2014. Your entire security apparatus was politicized. उनको पूरी तरह से आपने compromise कर दिया था, जिसके वजह से during that period a significant amount of land was lost to China, जिसके बारे में आज तक हमारे पास कोई data नहीं है. Therefore, to answer your question, there is no one silver bullet. You need to be able to counter him economically. You need to be able to counter him on the realm of infrastructure. You need to be able to counter him in the realm of diplomacy, international relations, and including in a military infrastructure. All of this is only possible if Bharat can generate the resources for it. जब तक पैसा नहीं होगा, ये सब आप कैसे करेंगे? Even in international diplomacy, you have to create lobbies. You have to talk to a lot of people. You have to fund departments. China today funds academic departments in the United States in the best of institutions, जो वहां पे बैठ के चाइना का गुणगान करते हैं. And भारत की ये हालत है कि अंदर बैठ के आपके एकेडमिक्स आज के डेट में भारत के एकेडमिक्स भारत के खिलाफ बात करते हैं. राइट? सो लुक एट द डिफरेंस. देयर इज नो पैरिटी, देयर इज सिंपली नो कंपैरिजन. अगर ये सोचते हैं कि 2014 के बाद ये पूरा सिचुएशन बदल गया है, थोड़ा बदला है क्योंकि भारत का एटीट्यूड बदला है, व्हिच इज व्हाई चाइना आज थोड़ा पीछे जा रहा है. लेकिन वो 10 कदम पीछे जाएगा, 5 कदम आगे आएगा, इसका मतलब नेट 5 कदम effectively he's come back. And that's exactly what he does. That's exactly what he does on the border. He will come 10 kilometers inside, move back 5 kilometers, और हम कहेंगे ये पीछे जा चुका है, but the fact is ये 5 किलोमीटर अंदर आ चुका है. That's exactly what happens everywhere. Okay? So we constantly look at Pakistan, our honest adversary, in the sense truly our biggest adversary is China. आप चाइना को मीट करने के लिए और उसके साथ लड़ने के लिए और एटलीस्ट उसके साथ जूझने के लिए तैयार होइए. You'll be ready for everyone. लेकिन अगर आप पाकिस्तान 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 किए जाएंगे, पाकिस्तान effectively dances to the tune of China. It has no independent mind. So focus on China, create more China experts, create more departments which focus on China at every level. भारत में ऐसे कितने लोग हैं जो मैंडरिन समझते हैं? आज नेपाल में बहुत सारे स्कूल्स में मैंडरिन सिखाना शुरू हो चुका है. Ideally, Nepal is civilizationally closer to us. वहां पे we should be talking of Indian languages. Mandarin वहां पे क्या कर रहा है? Because तिब्बत के साथ उसने जो 1955 में किया था, अगली बार नेपाल के साथ करेगा, लेकिन अलग तरीके से करेगा. He will invade without invading. So I think we have to get ready for these challenges, but unfortunately, India is being bogged down by its own internal challenges. that external challenges के लिए आपके पास ना energy है ना focus है. I think we are done with the question.
Thank you, sir. Due to paucity of time, we'll not be able to take any more questions. I'm sure sir will be gracing us in the future with his presence again. So probably we can take all your questions then. Mayank, over to you now.
So yes, so it was absolutely wonderful to listen to all your thoughts and about all of the questions that were posed to you today. And even the batch was fortunate to have someone like you among us with such credentials and experience. We would definitely have loved to hosted you in person as well. And probably if we get the chance, we would like to do the same. But thank you for sharing all your candid thoughts today on the various topics that were posed to you. The discussion went on to a quite an intense level, and the amount of enthusiasm shown by the batch was also very good, and that made the discussion even more enthralling. We probably cannot put an end to this discussion, but however, given the constraints of time that we have, we'll have to bring the session to an end, and we definitely look forward to host you again soon, sir. We definitely feel a lot enriched after this session. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for this opportunity. And I previously have interacted with the Public Policy Club of IIM Ahmedabad. And I think I've had a discussion with, I think, one of your programs in the Extension Center in Noida. So this is the first time I'm actually having a discussion with you guys. So thank you for your insightful questions and for the patience with which you've listened. And I'm happy to share space with you. So let me just do this last minute advertisement. Please order the book.
Sure, sir. We will definitely. We actually wanted to have a brief about the book. So if you could just give us a brief, what does the book talk about?
So, firstly, let's come to the economics. If you buy it now, there's a 26% off. So a book that costs close to 800, you get it about 595. And if you're a fan of Kindle, then you get it about $279, which I think is nothing for students from IIM Lucknow. You should consider ordering it. The launch of the book is slated or scheduled for the 13th of August. The book is called India, that is Bharat, and these words are lifted directly from Article 1 of the Constitution. The subtitle is Coloniality, Civilization and Constitution, which effectively translates to the 3 sections of the book. That is the structure of the book. It's divided into 3 sections. It speaks of European globalized, let's say, colonialism of the world, and Bharat's experience with European colonialism and its direct impact on the formulations of the Bharat's constitution. So this is effectively the structure of the book. This book is book 1 of what I call the Bharat trilogy. So this second book will hopefully come out next year, and the third book the year following that. So if you read this, I hope to trigger a few conversations. And I've dealt with the origins of words such as humanism, secularism, toleration, so on and so forth. I've also dealt with Middle Eastern colonialism. So I hope to, at least I can say this, that it's an interesting book for anyone who's interested in civilizational studies, in history. And since every discussion today in popular discourse revolves around the Constitution, you'll be able to make better sense of the Constitution once you read this book. That is the hope in which the book has been written. So let's see what you guys have to say after reading the book. It's currently number 1 across political categories on Amazon. So if you guys order, it will retain that position.
Sure, sir. Thank you so much for gracing us with your presence, sir. Now we would like to end the session.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, students. Thank you, everyone.